Welcome back to Criminology and Forensic Science. In today's video, we are going to cover an extremely important topic from UGC NET Forensic Science Unit 1, Search Methods for Physical Evidence. Imagine investigators arriving at a crime scene. There may be fingerprints on a glass, fibers on a sofa, a tiny blood stain on the floor, a weapon somewhere in the room, or even a microscopic trace that is almost impossible to notice with the naked eye. Now imagine investigators simply walking around and looking wherever they feel like looking. Would that be a reliable investigation? Definitely not. A crime scene must be searched systematically so that evidence is located, documented, and collected without unnecessary disturbance or contamination. In this video, we will understand what crime scene search means, the major systematic search patterns, how investigators locate physical evidence, and most importantly, why proper searching is critical in forensic investigation. A crime scene search is the systematic examination of a crime scene for the purpose of locating, identifying, documenting, and ultimately collecting physical evidence. The objective is not simply to find something. The objective is to make sure that potentially relevant evidence is not overlooked. Physical evidence can exist in many forms. It may be biological evidence, such as blood, saliva, semen, hair, or tissue. It may be trace evidence, such as fibers, glass fragments, paint, soil, or gunshot residue. It may include fingerprints, footwear, impressions, tool marks, weapons, documents, electronic devices, or objects that establish a connection between the victim, suspect, and a crime scene. Think about a burglary scene. An investigator may immediately notice a broken window and assume that the important evidence is the broken glass, but a systematic search could reveal much more: a partial fingerprint on the window frame, a footwear impression outside the window, fibers caught on the broken edge, or a small bloodstain left when the offender cut their hand on the glass. If investigators focus only on the obvious evidence, these less visible clues could easily be missed. This is one of the simplest ways to understand the importance of systematic searching. Suppose you enter a large room looking randomly for a small piece of evidence, such as a cartridge case. You walk towards the table, then the window, then the doorway, and finally corner of the room. You may believe you have searched the entire room, but there is no guarantee that every area was actually examined. Now imagine that the same room is divided into clearly defined sections, and investigators examine each section according to a predetermined pattern. The possibility of overlooking evidence is reduced. A systematic search also helps investigators avoid unnecessary movement through the scene. This is important because investigators themselves can accidentally disturb footprints, transfer fibers, move objects, or contaminate biological evidence. So remember this basic principle for a UGC NET examination. A crime scene should be searched systematically, not randomly, to maximize the recovery of relevant evidence while minimizing disturbance and contamination. Different search patterns are used depending on the size and characteristics of the scene, the type of the evidence expected, the terrain, and the number of the investigators available. The major approaches you should know for UGC NET are spiral, grid, strip or line, zone or quadrant, and wheel or ray search. Let's understand each one carefully. In a spiral search, the investigators follow a spiral path through the crime scene. There are two possible directions. The investigator may begin at the outside and gradually move towards the center, or begin at the center and move outward. Imagine a large open area where investigators believe a weapon or small item may have been discarded. Instead of walking randomly across the area, the investigator follows a controlled spiral path, gradually covering the entire search area. A spiral search can be particularly useful when there is one investigator and the scene is relatively open and unobstructed. However, it has limitations. Maintaining an accurate spiral can be difficult when the terrain is irregular or when there are many obstacles. It may also be less suitable for a highly cluttered indoor scene. For example, imagine a suspect fleeing from a location and throwing a small object into an open field. An investigator searching alone could establish the boundary of the relevant area and conduct a spiral search towards the center. The control movement provides a more organized examination than randomly walking across the field. For examination purposes, remember spiral search is equal to circular movement gradually inward or outwards. The grid search is essentially a more intensive version of the strip or line search. In a grid search, the area is searched in one direction first and then searched again in a direction approximately perpendicular to the first search. Imagine searching a rectangular outdoor crime scene. First, investigators move from north to south in parallel lines, examining the entire area. After completing that pass, they repeat the search from east to west. The result is a pattern resembling a grid. Why is this useful? Because an object that might be overlooked during the first pass may become visible during the second pass from a different direction. Now, for example, suppose investigators are searching a large grassy area for a small cartridge case. During the first pass, sunlight or grass may make the cartridge case difficult to see. During the perpendicular second pass, the investigator may view the same area from a different angle and notice it. Therefore, the grid search provides greater coverage and a more thorough examination than a single direction search. For UGC NET, just remember, grid search means two systematic searches conducted in approximately perpendicular directions. The strip or line search is one of the simplest systematic search methods. Investigators move along parallel lines across the scene, examining the area as they progress. This is particularly useful for large outdoor areas. Imagine a large field where investigators are looking for a weapon, clothing, cartridge cases, or other objects. Several investigators can be positioned along a line and move forward together while maintaining their relative positions. Each investigator examines their assigned portion of the area. For example, suppose investigators are searching an agricultural field after a violent crime. Rather than allowing everyone to walk wherever they want, investigators establish a search boundary. Several personnel then move across the field in parallel lines. If one investigator notices something suspicious, the search can be stopped or marked while the evidence is documented according to the scene protocol. The major advantage is that a large area can be covered efficiently. The important distinction is strip or line search is a movement in parallel lines, generally in one direction. A zone search, also called a quadrant search, involves dividing the crime scene into smaller sections or zones and searching each section separately. This approach is especially useful for large indoor scenes, buildings, vehicles, or complicated areas where searching the entire scene as one unit would be difficult. Imagine a house containing a living room, kitchen, bedroom, hallway, and garage. Instead of treating the entire property as one huge search area, investigators can divide it into zones as Zone 1 living room, Zone 2 kitchen, Zone 3 bedroom, Zone 4 garage. Each zone can then be systematically examined. The advantage is that investigators can assign particular areas to specific personnel and maintain better control over what has already been searched. Consider a suspected homicide inside a large house. Investigators might discover blood evidence in the bedroom, but that does not mean the bedroom is the only relevant area. The victim may have moved through the hallway, the offender may have entered through the kitchen, and an object connected to the crime may have discarded in the garage. Dividing the property into zones helps ensure that each area receives attention. So zones search is nothing but dividing the scene into sections and searching each section systematically. The wheel or ray search involves searching outward from a central point along imaginary lines, much like the spokes of a wheel. Imagine a circular crime scene. Investigators establish a central point and search outward along different radii. This method can be useful in certain circular or large outdoor scenes, particularly where the center of the scene is known or significant. However, one limitation is that the areas between the rays may not be receiving adequate coverage unless the investigators deliberately account for them. So while the wheel search can be useful in particular circumstances, it may not provide the same uniform coverage as some other search methods. So remember, wheel or ray search is nothing but the movement along radiating lines from a central point. Let's quickly compare them. A spiral search involves circular movement gradually inward or outward. A strip or line search involves parallel lines moving across the area. A grid search involves searching in one direction and then repeating the search approximately perpendicular to the first direction. A zone or quadrant search divides the scene into smaller sections and examines each section individually. A wheel or ray search involves movement along radiating lines from a central point. The choice of method is not arbitrary. Investigators consider the nature and size of the scene, terrain, accessibility, type of evidence expected, number of personnel, and environmental conditions. Now let's come to another important part of this topic, that is locating physical evidence. Finding evidence is not always as simple as spotting an object lying on the floor. Some evidence is obvious. For example, a firearm lying next to a victim may immediately attract attention, but other evidence can be extremely subtle. Imagine a suspect climbs through a broken window. There could be microscopic glass fragments embedded in clothing, fibers transferred from the window frame, fingerprints on the glass, or a small bloodstain produced by a cut. None of these may be immediately obvious. Therefore, investigators need to think about the possible activities that occurred at the scene. Where did the people enter? Where did they move? What objects were touched? Where could an item have been dropped? Could biological material have been deposited? Could trace material have been transferred? This is where knowledge of Locard's exchange principle becomes particularly important. Locard's principle is commonly summarized as whenever two objects come into contact, there is an exchange of material. For example, imagine an offender climbing through a window. The offender may leave fibers behind. At the same time, tiny particles from the window, dust, soil, or glass may become attached to the offender's clothing. This means investigators should not simply search for large, obvious objects. They should also look for trace evidence resulting from contact and movement. One famous example of trace evidence playing an important role in criminal investigation is the Wayne Williams case in Atlanta, where fibers recovered from victims were compared with fibers associated with Williams and his environment. The fiber evidence became an important part of the prosecution's case. This demonstrated why investigators need to think beyond obvious objects. A tiny fiber may appear insignificant, but scientifically it can potentially help establish an association between people, objects, and locations. Now we come to perhaps the most important question: why is proper searching so important? The first reason is evidence preservation. If evidence is overlooked, it may never be recovered. A small fiber can be destroyed, a footprint can disappear, or biological material can degrade. The second reason is avoiding contamination. Investigators can unintentionally introduce foreign material into a scene. For example, careless movement through a bloodstained area can disturb the pattern or transfer material from one location to another. The third reason is maintaining the integrity of the investigation. Every piece of evidence should have a clear relationship with its location and circumstances of discovery. Proper scene examination helps establish accurate documentation. The fourth reason is reconstructing events. Evidence doesn't exist in isolation. The position of a weapon, bloodstained patterns, footwear impressions, broken objects, fibers, and other evidence may collectively help investigators understand what happened. Let's put everything together with the hypothetical example. Imagine investigators arrive at a suspected burglary. The front window is broken. If they simply walk into the house and start looking around, they could disturb evidence. Instead, the scene is first secured and documented. Investigators establish the boundaries of the scene and determine the appropriate search strategy. They may divide the house into zones. The living room is searched systematically. Investigators examine surfaces for fingerprints, look for displaced objects, and check for trace evidence. The window area receives particular attention because it may represent the point of entry. They may find a footwear impression outside the window, a fingerprint on the frame, glass fragments on the ground, and perhaps fibers caught on the broken edge. The important point is that none of these findings should be considered in isolation. Together, they may provide information about how the offender entered, what they touched, and how they moved through the scene. This is the purpose of a systematic search, not simply to find evidence, but to maximize the probability of finding relevant evidence while preserving its context. So, how does an investigator decide which search pattern to use? There is not one universal search pattern that is appropriate for every crime scene. Investigators consider several factors. First is the size of the scene. A small room and a large agricultural field obviously require different strategies. Second is the type of the scene. An indoor scene with multiple rooms may be better approached using zones, whereas a large outdoor area may be suitable for line strip or grid searching. Third is the terrain and physical obstacles. Furniture, vegetation, uneven ground, walls, vehicles, and other obstacles can influence the choice. Fourth is the type of evidence expected. If investigators are looking for very small trace evidence, a more intensive search may be necessary. Fifth is the number of investigators available. Some patterns can be efficiently conducted by several people working together, while others may be more suitable for a single investigator. Environmental conditions also matter. Poor lighting, rain, wind, darkness, or extreme temperatures can affect the ability to locate and preserve evidence. Let's also understand what can go wrong. The first mistake is random searching. Without a defined strategy, areas may be missed. The second is focusing only on obvious evidence. A weapon may attract attention, but microscopic trace evidence can also be significant. The third is unnecessary movement through the scene. Every unnecessary movement creates an opportunity for evidence to be disturbed or contamination to occur. The fourth is failing to document evidence properly before moving it. Evidence should be documented in its original context before collection. And finally, investigators should avoid assuming that an area is irrelevant simply because nothing obvious is visible. Sometimes the most important evidence is the evidence that is the easiest to overlook. Before we finish, let's revise the important points. Crime scene search is the systematic examination of a scene to locate and identify potential physical evidence. Spiral search involves circular movement inward or outward. Strip or line search involves parallel lines moving systematically across the scene. Grid search involves two searches conducted approximately perpendicular to each other. Zone or quadrant search divides the scene into smaller sections. Wheel or ray search involves movement outward from a central point. The selection of a search pattern depends on factors such as scene size, scene type, terrain, expected evidence, environmental conditions, and available personnel. And most importantly, systematic searching helps maximize evidence recovery while reducing the possibility of overlooking, disturbing, or contaminating evidence. Now, here's a question you may encounter in a UGC NET style examination. Which of the following involves searching an area in two directions approximately perpendicular to each other? Your options are spiral search, grid search, wheel search, zone search. The correct answer is B, that is grid search. Why? Because in grid search, the area is searched systematically in one direction and then searched again in a direction approximately perpendicular to the first search. Here's another one. Which search method divides a crime scene into smaller sections for systematic examination? The answer is zone or quadrant search. And remember this simple memory trick. Spiral means circle, line means parallel, grid means cross-check, zone means divide, and wheel is to radiate. So the next time you see a crime scene investigation in a movie where investigators simply walk around picking up objects, remember that a real forensic investigation is much more methodical. A crime scene is not just a place where evidence happens to be found, it is an environment that must be carefully searched, documented, interpreted, and preserved. A systematic search increases the chance that even a tiny piece of physical evidence can be located and connected to the events under investigation. And in forensic science, sometimes the smallest clue can make the biggest difference. If you found this explanation useful for your UGC NET preparation, make sure you like the video, subscribe to Criminology and Forensic Science, and turn on the notification bell for more structured forensic science and criminology lessons. I'll see you in the next video.